The blind dog suddenly froze in the middle of the veterinary hallway and began barking at a reflection that shouldn't have meant anything to him. Every person inside the clinic stopped moving. Cooper had been completely blind for nearly 11 months. Yet somehow his cloudy eyes were locked onto the polished metal cabinet across the room, as if he could actually see something staring back at him. Melissa tightened her grip on the leash, her heartbeat pounding in her ears while the old Labrador trembled beside her. "Cooper, easy, buddy," she whispered softly, but the dog didn't respond to her voice the way he normally did. Instead, his ears twitched toward the reflection again, and a low, nervous whine escaped his throat. The strange part was that Cooper had never barked inside the clinic before. Not once. Even after dozens of appointments, blood tests, medications, and failed treatments, he had always stayed calm, almost heartbreakingly quiet, as if the darkness surrounding him had drained away the playful personality he used to have. But today felt wrong from the second they walked through the doors. The waiting room smelled strongly of disinfectant and rainwater from outside. A little girl flipping through a magazine suddenly stopped and stared when Cooper accidentally bumped into the leg of a chair hard enough to stumble sideways. Melissa quickly knelt beside him and rubbed his neck. "It's okay. I'm right here," she said, though her own voice shook with exhaustion. She had barely slept in days. Today was supposed to change everything, or destroy the last bit of hope she had left. Dr. Parker appeared from the hallway carrying a clipboard, but his expression immediately changed the moment he saw Cooper barking at the cabinet again. The veterinarian frowned and slowly stepped closer. "Has he been acting like this all morning?" he asked quietly. Melissa nodded. "Since we left the apartment. He keeps stopping and staring at things." Dr. Parker glanced toward the reflective cabinet doors and then back at Cooper's face. The dog's tail was tucked tightly underneath him now, but he refused to look away. It almost seemed like he was trying to recognize something. Impossible. Melissa swallowed hard. Just 1 year ago, Cooper had been the happiest dog in the neighborhood. Every morning, he waited by the window of her small Denver apartment to watch school buses pass by, wagging his tail every time children waved at him through the glass. But then his vision started fading. First came the hesitation on stairs, then the accidents into walls, then the nights where Melissa would wake up hearing him pacing through the dark apartment, terrified and confused, unable to find her bedroom. By the time winter arrived, Cooper could no longer see at all. And now, after months of saving money and praying for a miracle, today was the day of the surgery that might restore his sight, or leave him trapped in darkness forever. Thunder rumbled outside the clinic windows as Dr. Parker crouched carefully in front of Cooper. The old dog suddenly stopped barking. The room fell silent. Then, for the very first time in months, Cooper slowly lifted his head and stared directly into Melissa's eyes before backing away from her in fear. Melissa felt her stomach twist as Cooper pressed himself against the wall beside the examination room door, trembling so hard that the metal leash clip rattled softly against his collar. He had never pulled away from her before blindness took over his life. Back then, Cooper used to sleep sprawled across the foot of her bed every single night, his favorite tennis ball clenched proudly between his teeth like a trophy. He loved crowded parks, barking at squirrels, and chasing sprinklers during hot Colorado summers until his fur was soaked and shining under the sun. But little by little, those moments disappeared. It started so quietly that Melissa blamed herself for not noticing sooner. Cooper missed a jump onto the couch one evening and crashed awkwardly onto the hardwood floor. A week later, he stopped chasing balls altogether. Then came the strange habit that frightened her most. Every night around 2 in the morning, Cooper would wake up suddenly and stand completely still in the center of the apartment, listening to nothing. Sometimes he stayed frozen for almost 10 minutes, his cloudy eyes aimed toward empty corners of the room while soft, nervous whines escaped his throat. Melissa tried everything to comfort him. She bought special floor mats so he could recognize different rooms by texture. She placed tiny bells near his food bowl and water dish so he could locate them easier. She even stopped rearranging furniture because once, after moving a chair just a few inches, Cooper walked straight into it so hard that he cried out and hid under the kitchen table for hours. The worst part was how quiet he became. Friends who visited the apartment could barely believe this was the same dog who once greeted strangers like lifelong family. Cooper no longer wagged his tail when someone knocked at the door. He stopped carrying toys around the apartment. Sometimes Melissa caught him sitting beside the living room window he used to love so much, staring into darkness that he could no longer understand. Yet even after losing his sight, Cooper still followed Melissa everywhere he could. Every morning before work, she would feel his nose gently press against the back of her hand while she poured coffee into a travel mug. At night, he waited outside the bathroom door until he heard her footsteps again. It was as if Melissa had become the only safe thing left in his shrinking world. That was why the moment in the clinic terrified her so deeply. Cooper had looked directly at her moments earlier, and then recoiled like he did not recognize her at all. Dr. Parker slowly stood up and adjusted his glasses, watching the Labrador carefully. "His stress levels are much higher than usual," he murmured quietly. Melissa rubbed Cooper behind the ears, but the dog remained stiff beneath her touch. Outside the exam room, thunder rolled again across the Denver sky while rain streaked down the windows in long gray lines. A veterinary assistant walked past carrying a small tray of surgical tools, and Cooper suddenly flinched before lowering himself flat against the floor. Melissa knelt beside him immediately. "You are okay, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Cooper slowly rested his chin against her shoe, exhausted and defeated. For a brief second, Melissa thought he had finally calmed down. Then she noticed something that made the blood drain from her face. Cooper's cloudy eyes were no longer pointed toward her voice. They were fixed silently on the dark hallway behind Dr. Parker, as if he could see someone standing there. Dr. Parker slowly turned toward the empty hallway behind him, but there was nobody there. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead while rainwater tapped against the clinic windows. Yet Cooper continued staring into the darkness with an intensity that made the room feel colder. Melissa tried pulling gently on the leash. "Come on, buddy," she whispered, hoping to redirect him before the surgery team arrived. But Cooper suddenly planted all four paws firmly against the floor and refused to move. The old Labrador was not growling or barking anymore. Somehow that frightened Melissa even more. His breathing had become shallow and uneven, and his ears twitched every few seconds as though he was listening to footsteps nobody else could hear. Dr. Parker crouched beside him again, carefully avoiding sudden movements. "Cooper," he said calmly, "look at me." But the dog ignored him completely. Instead, Cooper slowly lifted one paw and pressed it against the tiled floor in front of him 3 times in a deliberate rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Then he froze again. Melissa blinked in confusion. "He has never done that before," she murmured quietly. The veterinarian frowned, but said nothing. A few minutes later, the surgical assistant arrived with paperwork and a wheeled gurney to transport Cooper upstairs for pre-operation preparation. The moment the metal wheels squeaked across the hallway floor, Cooper reacted violently with panic. He jerked backward so suddenly that the leash nearly slipped from Melissa's hands. The Labrador spun in a tight circle, disoriented and trembling, before shoving himself underneath the waiting room bench as though trying to hide from something invisible. Several people in the clinic stared nervously. One older man holding a tiny terrier muttered under his breath, "That dog does not seem right." Melissa's cheeks burned with embarrassment and fear as she knelt beside the bench. "Cooper, please," she begged. Softly. Usually her voice calmed him instantly, but today the dog barely acknowledged her. His nose kept twitching rapidly toward the hallway while his body shook uncontrollably. Dr. Parker exchanged a quick, uneasy glance with the surgical assistant before stepping away to review the chart again. Melissa could hear them whispering near the front desk, though she could not make out the words. Cooper had always hated loud noises after losing his sight, but this felt different. It was almost as if he was anticipating something terrible before it happened. Eventually, after several exhausting minutes, Melissa managed to coax him out from beneath the bench using one of his favorite peanut butter treats. Cooper approached cautiously, but instead of eating it right away, he lowered his nose toward Melissa's hand and sniffed it over and over again with growing confusion. Then he suddenly turned away without touching the treat at all. Melissa felt her heart sink. Cooper had never refused peanut butter in his entire life. The surgery nurse finally returned and gently clipped a blue hospital band around Cooper's collar. The second the plastic snapped shut, Cooper released a strange sound that nobody in the room had ever heard before. It was not a bark. It was not a cry. It sounded almost human, like a frightened gasp pulled deep from his chest. Every conversation inside the clinic stopped instantly. Cooper slowly backed away from Melissa until the leash stretched tight between them, his cloudy eyes fixed on her face again. Then, before anyone could react, the blind Labrador carefully reached one paw upward and covered his own eyes. The entire examination room went silent after Cooper covered his own eyes with his paw. Even the receptionist outside stopped typing for a moment. Melissa felt a cold wave of panic crawl through her chest as she stared at her dog. The gesture had looked too deliberate to be random. Cooper stayed frozen like that for several long seconds, breathing unevenly while the blue hospital band around his collar trembled against his fur. Finally, Dr. Parker exhaled slowly and stood upright. "Melissa," he said carefully, "I think we may need to postpone the surgery." The words hit her like a punch. "What?" she whispered immediately. "No, we cannot postpone it. We already paid the deposit. You said today was his best chance." Dr. Parker rubbed his jaw uneasily before glancing toward the hallway, where two assistants were now quietly watching Cooper from a distance. "I know," he replied softly, "but these behaviors are escalating too quickly. Disorientation is one thing. Severe neurological distress is another." Melissa looked down at Cooper in disbelief. The Labrador had lowered his paw now, but he remained completely motionless beside her chair, staring blankly toward the floor tiles. Hearing strangers discuss him like he was broken made her stomach ache. "He is scared," she insisted. "That is all this is." Dr. Parker hesitated before answering. "I am not sure anymore." A heavy silence filled the room. Cooper suddenly tilted his head toward the surgical hallway again and released another low, strained sound from deep in his throat. One of the veterinary assistants stepped backward immediately. "Doctor, what if he wakes up aggressive after anesthesia?" she asked nervously. Melissa's head snapped toward her. "Aggressive?" she repeated sharply. "Cooper has never hurt anyone in his life." The assistant looked embarrassed but did not respond. Dr. Parker crouched beside Cooper one more time and carefully waved two fingers near the dog's face to test his reaction. Cooper did not flinch. Then the veterinarian gently touched the side of his neck. Instantly, the Labrador jerked away and backed directly into the corner of the room, panting hard. Melissa rushed toward him, but Cooper startled again when she reached for his leash. For one terrible second, he seemed afraid of her touch too. That moment changed the atmosphere completely. Dr. Parker slowly stood and removed his surgical gloves. "Melissa," he said quietly, "I need you to understand something. If this behavior is neurological instead of emotional, putting him under anesthesia could be dangerous." Her eyes filled instantly. "So what are you saying?" Dr. Parker looked genuinely conflicted now. "I think we should transfer Cooper to overnight observation first. Run additional brain scans. Monitor him before proceeding." Melissa felt anger rising beneath her fear. "You said this surgery could restore his sight. He has already waited months." "And I still believe it can," the veterinarian replied. "But right now he is showing signs we cannot ignore." Cooper suddenly stood up without warning and walked slowly toward the exam room door. But instead of stopping there, he carefully pressed his forehead against the bottom corner of the wall beside it, completely still, almost as if he was listening through the drywall itself. The assistants exchanged nervous looks again. One whispered quietly, "This is not normal." Melissa knelt beside Cooper, tears burning in her eyes. "Please do not take him away from me tonight," she whispered into his fur. Cooper did not react. He just remained pressed against the wall, trembling softly. Then Dr. Parker made the decision Melissa had been dreading most. He reached for the clipboard near the counter and said, "Prepare a separate holding room upstairs. I do not think Cooper should stay with the other animals anymore." Melissa stood frozen beside the examination table as Cooper was slowly guided upstairs by a veterinary assistant holding a second leash attached to his collar for safety. The Labrador did not resist, but something about the way he moved unsettled everyone watching. Cooper was no longer walking like a frightened dog. He moved carefully, deliberately, pausing every few feet as if checking the air around him before taking another step. The assistant escorting him kept glancing nervously at Dr. Parker while whispering under her breath, clearly uncomfortable being alone with him. Melissa wiped tears from her cheeks and reached instinctively toward Cooper one last time before the elevator doors closed. "I will be right here when you come back down," she whispered softly. For a brief moment, Cooper turned his head toward her voice. Then the elevator doors slid shut between them. Nearly an hour passed in the waiting room while rain hammered against the clinic windows hard enough to blur the parking lot outside. Melissa sat curled forward in her chair, clutching Cooper's old tennis ball in both hands like a lifeline. Upstairs, Dr. Parker reviewed neurological risk forms, while veterinary assistant Kayla monitored Cooper through the holding room window. At first, everything seemed normal. Cooper paced slowly around the room, sniffing corners and occasionally pausing beneath the dim ceiling light. But then Kayla noticed something strange. Every few minutes, Cooper stopped beside the exact same section of wall and tilted his head toward a mounted ventilation grate near the floor. Not barking, not whining, just listening. The behavior repeated so precisely that she finally walked closer to observe him herself. "What are you hearing, buddy?" she murmured quietly through the glass. Cooper immediately turned toward her voice, but instead of approaching her, he backed away from the center of the room and positioned himself directly in front of the vent like he was blocking it. Kayla frowned. The holding room had been empty all morning. There should not have been anything unusual inside. Yet Cooper's reaction felt too intentional to ignore completely. A few minutes later, while changing water bowls for another patient nearby, Kayla heard a faint metallic tapping sound echo through the hallway ventilation system. Tap, tap, tap. Her chest tightened slightly. It was the exact same rhythm Cooper had made earlier with his paw in the examination room downstairs. She stopped walking immediately and listened again. Silence. Kayla glanced toward Cooper's holding room. Through the small glass window, the old Labrador was standing perfectly still facing the vent once more. His ears twitched sharply. Then he slowly lowered himself onto the floor directly against it, refusing to move. Uneasy now, Kayla opened the room door carefully and stepped inside. "Cooper," she called gently. The dog did not react to her presence at all. Instead, he stretched one paw forward until it rested lightly over the bottom edge of the vent cover. That was when Kayla noticed something else. A cold draft was blowing from inside the vent, even though the heating system upstairs had been shut off hours earlier because of the storm outside. She crouched lower and stared at the grate. Tiny water. Droplets clung to the metal edges as if warm air had recently passed through from somewhere below. Her stomach twisted uneasily. Cooper suddenly lifted his head and let out a soft, anxious breath, not toward her, but toward the vent itself. Kayla slowly stood up and backed toward the doorway without taking her eyes off the dog. Then she immediately reached for the hallway phone and called Dr. Parker. "Doctor," she said quietly, "I think before we move forward with surgery, you need to come upstairs and see what Cooper keeps trying to warn us about." Dr. Parker arrived upstairs less than 2 minutes later with Melissa close behind him, still clutching Cooper's leash with trembling fingers. The moment they entered the holding room, Cooper stood up abruptly from beside the vent and backed toward the far corner, as if trying to force everyone's attention downward. Kayla pointed toward the grate near the floor. "He has not stopped reacting to that thing for almost an hour," she explained quietly. "And I heard tapping coming through it." Dr. Parker crouched beside the vent and pressed his palm against the metal cover. His expression changed instantly. "It is warm," he muttered under his breath. That made no sense. The upstairs heating system had been turned off because of electrical fluctuations during the storm. Melissa stared at Cooper, confused and exhausted. "What is happening?" she whispered. Cooper suddenly released a sharp bark that echoed through the room, startling everyone. Then he slammed one paw directly against the vent cover. Clang, clang, clang. The exact same rhythm again. Dr. Parker immediately grabbed a screwdriver from the maintenance cabinet outside the room, while Kayla stepped back nervously. Cooper stopped barking the second the veterinarian knelt beside the grate again. The Labrador's entire body trembled with urgency now, but for the first time all day, Melissa noticed something different in his expression. He did not seem afraid anymore. He seemed desperate. Dr. Parker loosened the screws one by one until the vent cover finally came free with a metallic scrape. A rush of warm, stale air poured out from inside the duct. Then everyone froze. Somewhere deep inside the ventilation shaft, a faint voice cried out weakly. "Help!" Melissa covered her mouth in shock. Kayla stumbled backward against the wall. Dr. Parker immediately dropped to his knees and shined his phone flashlight into the narrow duct opening. About 20 feet inside the shaft, partially hidden behind a bend in the metal tunnel, was a terrified teenage maintenance worker curled tightly against the side wall. His flashlight lay shattered beside him. The young man looked pale and exhausted, barely conscious. "Oh my God," Kayla whispered breathlessly. The teenager had apparently fallen through a damaged maintenance panel during the storm while checking electrical wiring above the clinic. Because the thunder outside had been so loud all afternoon, nobody downstairs had heard his calls for help. Nobody except Cooper. Dr. Parker immediately radioed emergency responders, while another staff member rushed upstairs with tools to widen the vent opening enough for rescue crews. Melissa stood frozen beside Cooper, tears pouring silently down her face as realization hit her all at once. Every strange thing Cooper had done suddenly made horrifying sense. The tapping, the panic, the refusal to leave the hallway, even covering his eyes. Cooper had not been losing control. He had been trying to force them to pay attention to sounds no one else noticed. The blind dog had heard the trapped teenager struggling inside the walls long before anyone else realized something was wrong. And because nobody understood him, they nearly separated him and canceled the surgery instead. Cooper slowly walked back toward Melissa now, exhausted from hours of stress. This time when she knelt beside him, he gently rested his head against her shoulder without fear. Dr. Parker stared at the Labrador in complete disbelief while rescue workers began pulling apart sections of the hallway wall outside the room. The veterinarian looked down at Cooper for several silent seconds before finally speaking in a shaken voice. "This dog was never confused," he whispered softly. "He was the only one in this building who understood there was someone trapped behind these walls, and we thought something was wrong with him." The rescue team finally pulled the exhausted teenager safely out of the ventilation shaft nearly 20 minutes later, and the entire upstairs hallway erupted into relieved applause and shaky laughter. But while paramedics wrapped the young worker in warm blankets and checked his pulse, nobody could stop staring at Cooper. The old Labrador stood quietly beside Melissa now, his body visibly drained from hours of tension, yet his ears still tracked every sound around him with incredible focus. It was almost impossible to believe that the same dog they had nearly isolated upstairs as a neurological risk had just saved someone nobody else even knew was missing. Dr. Parker slowly removed his glasses and rubbed both hands across his face, looking deeply unsettled by his own earlier judgment. "I told you he was unstable," he murmured bitterly to himself. Melissa looked down at Cooper and suddenly remembered every painful moment from the past year differently. The nights he stood frozen in dark corners. The way he listened so carefully before entering rooms. The strange tapping rhythms. Even the way he reacted to tiny sounds most people ignored. Cooper had not become distant because blindness broke him. He had adapted to the world in ways no one around him truly understood. And instead of trusting him, they treated his instincts like symptoms. Kayla slowly knelt beside Cooper while tears rolled silently down her cheeks. The veterinary assistant reached into her pocket and pulled out the peanut butter treat he had refused earlier. This time, instead of offering it immediately, she placed it gently on the floor beside him and whispered softly, "I am sorry, buddy." Cooper lowered his nose toward her hand carefully, almost cautiously, as if deciding whether he still trusted the people around him. Then, after a few quiet seconds, he rested his chin against her wrist. That simple gesture shattered whatever emotional control remained in the hallway. One of the paramedics turned away to wipe his eyes. Melissa covered her mouth as sobs escaped her chest. Even Dr. Parker looked overwhelmed now. He crouched beside Cooper and stared at the Labrador for several long moments before speaking again. "Do you realize what he actually did today?" he asked quietly. Melissa shook her head through tears. Dr. Parker glanced toward the damaged wall where emergency workers were still removing vent panels. "That teenager was nearly unconscious by the time we found him. The storm drowned out everything." If Cooper had stopped reacting when we ignored him, his voice trailed off unfinished. Nobody needed him to say the rest aloud. Cooper slowly moved toward Melissa, then and carefully nudged the old tennis ball still clutched in her hand. It was the first playful thing he had done in months. Melissa broke down completely after seeing it. She wrapped both arms around him while his tail gave a weak but unmistakable wag against the floor. Around them, clinic staff members began quietly replaying the entire day in their minds with growing guilt. The barking at reflections, the fear near the hallway, the tapping rhythms, covering his eyes, pressing against the walls. Every strange behavior had been Cooper desperately trying to guide them towards someone in danger. And all day long, they assumed the blind dog was the problem instead of the answer. Dr. Parker finally stood and made a decision that stunned everyone nearby. He walked directly to the surgical scheduling desk at the end of the hallway and pulled Cooper's file from the cancellation stack where it had already been placed. Then, without hesitation, he crossed out the overnight observation order completely. "Prepare operating room 2, he said firmly. "This dog is getting his surgery tonight. And after what he did for us today, I do not want him spending one more day trapped in darkness." The clinic felt completely different after Dr. Parker reopened Cooper's surgery file. Fear and suspicion were gone now, replaced by a strange tenderness that followed the old Labrador everywhere he walked. Staff members who had avoided him earlier suddenly moved more carefully around him, lowering their voices whenever he passed by, as though they understood they were standing near something extraordinary. Melissa remained beside Cooper the entire time while nurses prepared the operating room downstairs again. But instead of rushing him through the process like another patient, the clinic staff quietly changed everything about the environment to make him feel safe. The harsh fluorescent lights inside pre-operation recovery were dimmed softer. The loud metal kennel doors were left open to reduce echoing noises that might disorient him. One assistant even removed her squeaky shoes after noticing Cooper flinch at the sound in the hallway. Nobody told them to do these things. They simply wanted him to feel understood after everything he had done. Cooper seemed to notice the difference immediately. For the first time since arriving at the clinic that morning, his breathing slowly steadied. He no longer pressed himself against walls or froze at every unfamiliar sound. Instead, he stayed close beside Melissa with quiet trust, occasionally brushing his shoulder against her leg as if checking that she was still there. Dr. Parker personally carried a thick blanket into the preparation room and spread it gently across the floor instead of placing Cooper on the cold examination table. "He has spent enough time scared today," the veterinarian said softly while kneeling beside him. Cooper carefully stepped onto the blanket and slowly lowered himself down. Then something happened that made everyone in the room fall silent again. The Labrador stretched his body across the blanket until he was positioned directly beneath the warm air vent overhead. The same type of vent he had desperately tried to warn everyone about earlier. But this time, instead of trembling or panicking, Cooper rested peacefully underneath it with his head laid across his paws. It was as though he finally understood nobody was trapped behind the walls anymore. Melissa sat beside him on the floor while rain continued falling softly outside the clinic windows. She gently brushed her fingers through the gray fur around Cooper's ears and whispered stories from happier years he probably barely remembered now. The camping trip where he stole an entire bag of marshmallows from a picnic table. The afternoon he jumped into a lake after mistaking a floating football for one of his toys. The way he used to wait by the apartment window every evening exactly 10 minutes before she got home from work. Cooper listened quietly to every word. Occasionally his tail thumped lightly against the blanket whenever her voice brightened with laughter. Dr. Parker watched from the doorway for several long moments before finally walking over with something small in his hand. It was Cooper's blue hospital collar band that had frightened him earlier. Without saying a word, the veterinarian carefully unclipped it and replaced it with a soft green cloth ribbon usually reserved for therapy animals visiting children's hospitals. Melissa looked up in surprise. Dr. Parker smiled faintly. "I think he earned something better today," he said quietly. Cooper lifted his nose slightly when the ribbon brushed against his neck, then relaxed again without fear. A few minutes later, as the surgical team prepared anesthesia equipment nearby, Cooper slowly turned his cloudy eyes toward Melissa's voice and gave one long, peaceful sigh before falling asleep beside her feet for the very first time in months. The surgery lasted nearly 3 hours. Melissa spent every minute sitting in the dim waiting room beside the rain-covered windows with Cooper's old tennis ball resting quietly in her lap. Sometime after midnight, the storm outside finally faded into silence, leaving only the soft hum of hospital lights and distant footsteps echoing through the clinic halls. When Dr. Parker finally stepped through the operating room doors, exhaustion lined every part of his face, but for the first time all day, he was smiling. "He made it through," he said softly. Melissa covered her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks again. An hour later, Cooper was wheeled carefully into recovery wrapped in warm blankets, the green ribbon still resting gently around his neck. Thick protective bandages covered both of his eyes, and anesthesia left him sleepy and weak, but his tail gave one faint thump against the blanket the moment he heard Melissa's voice beside him. Over the next several days, the entire clinic seemed to quietly revolve around Cooper. Nurses who normally rushed between appointments stopped by recovery, just to sit with him for a few minutes. Someone placed a small handwritten sign outside his room that read, "Our hero is resting." Even the teenage maintenance worker Cooper had saved returned to visit after being discharged from the hospital himself. His name was Tyler, and he carried a new tennis ball in his hoodie pocket the first time he entered the recovery room. "I figured maybe his old one needed a friend," he said shyly. Cooper immediately recognized Tyler's voice and slowly wagged his tail across the blanket. Melissa nearly cried watching the moment unfold. 3 days later, the time finally came to remove Cooper's bandages. Dr. Parker insisted the entire clinic staff gather quietly in the recovery room before the procedure began. Nobody wanted to miss it. Melissa knelt directly in front of Cooper while he sat calmly on the blanket beneath the warm vent overhead, the same place where he had finally fallen asleep peacefully before surgery. Dr. Parker carefully loosened the final layer of gauze while the room held its breath. At first, Cooper blinked rapidly against the light, confused and uncertain. His cloudy eyes shifted nervously around the room as though the world itself no longer made sense. Then everything changed. Cooper suddenly froze. His eyes settled directly on Melissa's face. Not toward her voice. Not toward her footsteps. Her face. Melissa felt her breath catch in her throat as the Labrador slowly leaned forward, staring at her with trembling focus like he was trying to memorize every detail he had lost. Then, for the first time in nearly a year, Cooper's tail began wagging wildly against the floor. The old dog stood up too fast, stumbled clumsily against the blanket, then hurried toward Melissa with tears gathering visibly in the corners of his eyes. The entire room broke apart emotionally at once. Some people laughed through tears. Others covered their faces completely. Dr. Parker turned away for a second just to compose himself. But Cooper only cared about one thing. He pressed himself against Melissa's chest and stared up at her over and over again like he could not believe she was truly there. Later that morning, after the clinic quieted down again, Melissa opened the front doors and led Cooper outside into the cool Denver sunrise. The rainstorm had washed the streets clean overnight, and golden morning lights stretched across the parking lot in soft reflections. Cooper paused at the edge of the sidewalk and lifted his head slowly toward the sky. For a long moment, he simply stood there feeling sunlight reach his eyes again. Then he looked back at Melissa and gently dropped Tyler's new tennis ball at her feet. Some souls do not need sight to guide others home.